And where is the... Hey y'all, let's go ahead and sit down and get started. So let's, by the way, thank you everybody for coming today. There is no free lunch, so you have to listen to us for an hour. And then to earn your lunch, you have to ask us lots of really good, difficult questions. Well, ask the panelists, not me. Okay, so what I want to do is, there's plenty of room for everybody. I want to, again, thank you all for coming. This is great. The legislature has left town, so it's a normal, quiet place. My name is Jeff Mount. I'm a senior fellow here at the Public Policy Institute of California Water Policy Center, and one of the authors on the report that you are looking at today, although I did not take the lead on this report. I'm going to introduce the people who did that. I do want to remind you, for those of you who don't know PPIC, we are a nonpartisan, nonprofit think tank. We have offices in San Francisco and here in Sacramento, and we tackle a wide variety of issues. In particular, I'm part of the Water Policy Center, and we have, of course, some useful literature for you over here on this table that you're encouraged to take. A couple of recent reports that were stimulated by the drought. I'm going to get to that in just a second. First of all, there should be a copy of the report in everybody's seat, so be sure and grab that. And again, if they're not, back at the registration table or over on the side, there'll be more copies of it. We are not going to belabor biographies today for the speakers. That's all contained there. We're not going to talk a lot about that, but I do want to talk a little bit about the project itself. This project, this is part of a series of papers. Those of you who follow PPIC, you notice we've been very prolific on the drought and writing about the drought. And this is part of a project that is funded by the S.D. Bechtel Jr. Foundation and the EPA, the EPA. And this is focusing principally on the institutional response to drought. So this is a multi-year project we've been working on with many collaborators around California, and everything from the urban response to drought to what happened in disadvantaged communities to a close look at what's, in particular, the drought response in the San Joaquin Valley, which was really sort of the epicenter of some of these issues. And in a series of reports that'll come out in early November, we're looking at the environmental consequences of the drought, and in particular the management of water for the environment. So part of all of that, that's the nature of this series of talks today, and the panel discussions, which are going to focus on forests. And I'm going to come back to that in just a second. But as an additional highlight of the No Free Lunch motto in PPIC, on October 26th, the Water Policy Center is going to have we're going to have a session here in Sacramento on policy priorities for California's water, where we're going to lay out our vision for what we think the big priorities are going to be coming into the next year. And so I want to encourage you to attend. This is going to be at the Sheraton, and it'll be a half-day conference, and should be actually I promise it'll be very entertaining, because we'll say things that make you crazy. Okay, so let me get to the program today. Today's focus is on forests and forest health, and we're going to have a presentation by Van Butsic, who many of you know, who is from Berkeley and is actually an assistant cooperative extension specialist. And then we're going to have three panel members come up after Van's talk. And we've got and actually, it's a great panel, by the way. We have Barnie Gyant, who may be very well known to you. He's a regional forester for the Pacific Southwest region, Region 5. We have Susie Kocher, who's the Natural Resources Advisor and at Cooperative Extension in the Central Sierra region. She's here to talk about sort of family forests. And then we're going to also have David Edelson, who is also known to you, and he's the Sierra Nevada Project Director for the Nature Conservancy and has also a different perspective. So all three of those panelists will basically be responding to Van's presentation of our results, and I will go ahead and lead that, and then we'll end in the last half hour with you all having a Q&A with us. So the one thing I just want to finally mention, why are we picking forests? We're a water policy center. And so those of you who are expecting us to come up with a whole bunch of equations to tell you how much, if we manage forests, we're going to create yield in water, we're going to disappoint you, and we'll explain why we're going to disappoint you on that. But forests are integral to the natural infrastructure of California, and the health of those forests were challenged by this drought. And that's why this particular paper got enmeshed into our overall project on drought. And improving the health of those forests will make a terrific difference. And I am old enough now to have wandered through those forests for more than 60 years, and some of that with my grandmother, who had seen the forests long before. And I have seen dramatic, visible changes, and I'm not alone in that. Any of us who are middle-aged or older are really stunned by the changes in the forest. And so this is an urgent management issue. And with that, let me introduce Ben Butsic, who's going to go ahead and give us a talk on improving the health of California's rivers. Yeah, of course.
Thanks, Jeff. Real quickly, before we go in, I would like to recognize the other co-authors who are in the audience. So Jeff, and then Henry McCann. If you want to stand up and people can see your face in case they want to ask you a question afterwards, and Jody Axelson. And are any other co-authors here who I forgot? No, okay. So the other co-authors were a group from Berkeley, PPIC, Davis, sort of the usual suspects, I suppose. So we spent a year looking at how to improve the health of California's headwater forest. First of all, I want to tell you what the headwater forests are and why we decided to focus on these. We took a very applied definition of the headwater forest. Basically, we looked at the forest in the Southern Cascades and in the Sierra that were above the dams, right? So this is a very simple definition. Within this area, about 2/3 of the land is federally owned. So right away, we know that the federal government is going to be a big part of any solution to forest health in this area. About 1/3 of the forests are privately owned, and the vast majority of this privately owned forest is actually owned by small landowners. So landowners with less than 5,000 acres. So that's the setting for the headwater forest. Why did we decide to focus on it? Being a water policy center, the fact that it's the source of 2/3 of the state's surface water is, of course, very important. But there's a number of other benefits that come from the headwater forest as well, including habitat for endangered species, timber production for rural development and urban housing. Most of California's houses are still made of wood. Recreation, and of course, carbon sequestration. Here's our takeaways. We started out by scoping the problem, and we looked at the history of these forests. 150 years ago, a lot of the large trees were removed. Shortly after that, we started suppressing fire. Trees regrew. About 30 years ago, we stopped harvesting in much of this region. And so now here we are today with a very dense forest that's vulnerable to large-scale die-offs and catastrophic wildfires. We looked into how we could treat this forest. We looked at prescribed fire, managed wildfire, and mechanical thinning. And we realized that these 3 treatments were actually effective, but they're hard to use in California due to complex management environment. So we suggested a number of reforms along the lines of how can we increase the pace and scale of treatments in California. We looked at 3 main areas. The first one was managing for the long term and over large scales. Secondly, we looked at how to bundle treatments that generate revenue with treatments that don't generate revenue to make it economically affordable. And finally, we looked at ways to enhance cooperation between various types of landowners and other stakeholders. So now I'm going to go a little bit deeper into each part of the report, starting by scoping how forest health is in decline. If we look at the last 100 years, we see a dramatic increase in the number of small trees and a dramatic decrease in the number of large trees in the headwater forest. At the same time, besides just living density of forest, there's also an increase in the surface fuels, so the dead trees, the debris, the leaves on the ground, and the ladder fuels, which are the standing fuels, so the standing dead trees in our forest. All of these combine to lead to more severe wildfires. Over the last 100 years, then, we've seen a change in the structure of the headwater forest. Different sized trees and a different amount of trees. And so a question is, how is this working? How are these forests doing? And how will they do in the future? We think the 5-year drought was a pretty good test run. And what we saw was the forest didn't do well, right? We saw the largest mortality pulse ever recorded in California history, 15 million dead trees per year, most of this from bark beetle outbreak, which was influenced by the drought. We also saw an increase we saw 2 of the largest wildfires, both in terms of acreage and severity in state history. So we have a forest that's changed, and we've seen that it's probably not in a state that's well suited for a warmer future climate. So what can we do about it? We focused on 3 treatments: prescribed and managed wildfire. This is using fire as a tool to reduce forest density, reduce surface and ladder fuels. And we also looked at mechanical thinning. And this is a tool that we feel is very important, especially around houses, in areas where and in areas where there may be opportunities to harvest material that can be sold in the market. And that this process can make the whole system of prescribed fire and mechanical thinning affordable. So we felt like we had the treatments that were appropriate. But there's barriers to using these treatments in California. One of the barriers is a focus on avoiding short-term impacts, and this limits our ability to plan for long-term health. There's a natural, I don't know if it's natural, there's a historical directive to suppress fires, right? We don't like smoke, we don't like wildfires near our homes. But this leads to a situation where over decades, we have overly dense forest. Secondly, our treatment needs are poorly defined. We don't necessarily know exactly where we need the treatments or how much. A third barrier is that there's no single funding expansion that would help us pay for all the treatments we need. Right? There's not a program that we can go to and say, fund this program and we're good to go. It's much more complex than that. And finally, we know that there's a need to coordinate across various parties, stakeholders, landowners, and government agencies to work at a large enough scale to be effective. Oops, sorry. So what are the reforms we can use to take away these barriers and increase the pace and scale of action? First, we need to make forest health a top priority. At the federal level, we think that we need to find broader permitting tools that we can use that support long-term forest health. We've seen that managing for single species and single habitats doesn't work. And we need to find tools that allow us to manage at landscape scales for long-term forest health. Part of this is leveling the playing field between fire, suppression, and other management actions. So we know that historically, fire suppression leads to a decline in forest health. And yet, fire suppression is oftentimes the default action. We think that we need to figure out a way to make agencies justify fire suppression and show how that can impact forest health. Finally, we think at the state level, there's opportunities to embed long-term forest health into new management practices that are being established under AB 1492. The second set of recommendations are along the lines of defining treatment needs and making the most of available funding. So currently, it's hard to tell how much treatment is actually taking place in the woods. There's not standardized systems between the state government and the federal government where it's directly comparable. As researchers, this can make it difficult to know exactly what's going on. So if there could be a bit of a standardization of these accounting practices, it would be helpful in helping us make better decisions. There's opportunities to bundle harvesting with other treatments to help cover costs. So we've seen this take place in other states. In Idaho, they've been using stewardship contracts to do this. And finally, we need to collaborate on funding. So when we've talked to stakeholders across the state, we've had some stakeholders tell us, we need just a little bit of money so we can do the planning, and if we can do the planning, then we'll be able to do the treatments. We've talked to other stakeholders who have said, we have the plans done, but now we need the money for the treatment, right? So if we could coordinate and collaborate better across these projects, we think we could see a more efficient use of funding overall. The final set of recommendations focus on utilizing new and existing tools that facilitate collaboration. So there's some really exciting tools that have been developed in the past that are now available in California, and we think these tools hold a lot of potential. The first one is stewardship contracts on national forest lands. These are long-term contracts, up to 10 years, that can help assure private industry that there'll be a flow of material from the forest. And we think this can then incentivize investment for private forest management on national forest lands. As we showed in the first slide, about 2/3 of the Headwaters forest are federally managed. The Good Neighbor Authority, which gives the state some ability to collaboratively manage this land with the federal government, is something we need to be looking at in California. We've seen successful implementation of Good Neighbor Authority in Wisconsin and Idaho at broad scales, and we believe there's no reason why we can't see similar actions here in California. Finally, for the third of the land that's owned by private landowners, we think there's real potential for collaboration across landowners through the development of something like a forest health district. This could be similar to an irrigation district or a special district where the groups should be able to work together, decrease the cost on a per acre scale of management, and have better management outcomes overall. So to summarize our findings, it took decades to get where we are today. And there's no solution that turns things around immediately. It'll take years and decades to get the forest to a state that we want them. But importantly, the barriers to improving forest health are not technical. There's good science, and there's quite a bit of agreement between scientists on what we can do. Never 100% agreement, but there's quite a bit of agreement. But their barriers are legal, social, and financial, right? So we need to figure out how to work to take these barriers down. A lot of what we looked at are potential ideas such as stewardship contracting, such as the Good Neighbor Authority, that are already in place. But what's needed is determined leadership to make these things really move on the ground. And just having lunch today, we had great conversations about big projects that are going to happen. So, I see the determined leadership in this room, but we need this across the state, and we need to continue on this path for the future. Finally, a year of research has really convinced me that forest health should be a common goal for all Californians. These treatments are going to take place far away from urban areas, but the benefits from these forests, recreation, endangered species habitat, carbon sequestration, and surface water accrue to all Californians. And with that, I'll say thank you. So if our panelists will come on up.
That's the idea. So please come up and sit down, panelists. Susie, Barney, David. So before I start, I'd written down some notes myself. I have to acknowledge who on the PPIC side did the heavy lift for this. This is Henry McCann here. Henry has just busted his tail on this, and here I am looking like I'm taking credit for the work that he did, which I guess I am. There I am. I had a dean once at UC Davis who said, accrue all credit and assign all blame. So if you don't like it, talk to Henry. Right. Okay, so on our panel today, what we're going to do is spend the rest of this hour, and before we get into the Q&A, it's a chance to talk to the people who actually work on this stuff, and instead of those of us who don't, but we've learned a great deal from you. And I want to re-emphasize that the work that we've done is a body of work which is focused principally on restoring forest health. But we're gonna talk a little more broadly in that in our Q&A section here. And we have the advantage of people who work on this stuff. So let me start off right off the bat with Barney here. And Barney is well known to many of you here in this room. If you work on forests, you certainly know Barney's role with the Forest Service. And it was an inescapable conclusion that 2/3 of the area that we looked at, in the Headwater areas we looked at, are owned and managed by the federal government. And within that federal government, it's divided between, of course, the National Forest Service lands, as well as wilderness areas and also parks as well. But so that's, right off the bat, this is the source of the largest area. It also, when you look very closely, particularly at things like density of trees and the issues, amount of harvests, fuels, it's a big deal. The Forest Service land is a big deal, and so we tend to focus on the state side of this, but this is a big federal problem. So Barney, now that I've accused you of something, I sort of didn't make it sound like that. I mean, this is the challenge that comes up for the Forest Service in particular to do this. And I know there's lots of good plans out there, but we have made the statement, and you can challenge it, by the way. We have made the statement that the federal government needs to shift away from a focus on trying to avoid near-term consequences, unpleasantness, or things that people will sue them over, for example, and take a long view. That is the multi-decadal view, because of course it took us decades to get into this problem. Are we wrong on that? And if we're not wrong, what's holding the federal government from actually taking that kind of approach? What do you see as the principal challenges for you guys being able to take that long view? And of course, it isn't just the long view, but it's the large scale.
What a way to start the conversation
I
after
know.
lunch, huh?
So friendly.
Yeah, so I'm Barney Gyant. I'm the Deputy Regional Forester for Resources. So I'm not the Regional Forester, so we
sorry
want to
about
make that clear. So I'm the Deputy for Resources. And so
Remember, accrue all credit and assign all blame.
Yeah, so I don't need that getting back to my boss. I'm claiming being a regional forester. So to put it in context, let me tell you the areas that I oversee as a deputy. So I oversee budget, tribal relations, ecosystem management, which is like all the fish, wildlife, reforestation, range. I also oversee NEPA and litigation and information management and monitoring, all the areas that I oversee as a deputy for resources. So the question that you asked, Houston, we have a problem. And so I kind of got some challenges kind of written down here. And what I'm going to talk about is the Barnie Gyant perspective of having been in my job for about 5 years here in the state. So about 2012, we really started seeing indications of large fires. And right around that same time, drought occurred, but we never really made the connection with both of those. And then in 2013, you guys remember there was a rim fire, and so it just kind of get on and on and on. So here's a challenge for us as an agency. Some years ago, we did harvest more timber than what we do currently. We only probably right now only harvest maybe about a fraction or 25% of what we did some years ago. And with that reduced amount that Congress asked us to do, that means less acres that are treated. And so what happens is so as we stopped harvesting timber as much, you have a lot more trees, a lot more fuels. And so now we have a system that's broke. But here's a couple challenges that I see. We need to offer incentives for using our own wood in California. And what I mean by that is for us, we know that removing small material is a must, but it's hard. So just recently we have 6 biomass facilities that have contract extensions, but they're for 5 years. But for a long time, and a lot of people in this room, we talked a lot about how do you use biomass as a source of energy? And guess what? We really didn't get a lot of traction. When you think about biomass, and when it's in competition with natural gas, solar, and wind, doesn't pencil out. So now we've got these contracts, related to tree mortality, and I was at the Little Hoover Commission, and the challenge I had then is we can't wait until those contracts are up before we decide to do something. So from my perspective, how do we incentivize using our own wood? Which means not only, biomass for energy, go to Home Depot or Lowe's and see where our wood is coming from. So that's one challenge. How do we incentivize using our own wood? Second, fire suppression now takes over 50% of our national budget. And so what happens is our budget is like a pie. And so when one resource area increases, what that means are other resource areas decrease. So with fire being over 50% of our overall budget, that means other programs actually suffer as a result of that. Now Congress and Senate, they're going back and forth, but we haven't landed on anything yet that treats wildfires like emergencies like hurricanes, and that's an issue for us. So, and you think about the last couple of years, we spent a lot of money, the National Forest and CAL FIRE on fire suppression. Rough math says in 2015 we spent probably close to $1 billion between the two of us, and in 2016 I think we also spent close to $1 billion between the both of us. And then guess what? In 2017, our predictions are that we're going to surpass that figure. So if you do some rough math, if you do the 3 years, that's probably about $3 billion just in California for fire suppression. So here's a challenge for us generally. Why is it okay for us to be reactionary versus us being proactive. Because if you pay taxes, you pay for them billions of dollars I just talked about. And not only that, you think about what the impacts are to possible sedimentation getting into our reservoirs, losing storage capacity, habitat destruction for a lot of threatened and endangered species or sensitive species, the impacts to counties. When you think and you look at how much national forest is in a lot of our counties, and if your economy is based on tourism, the last time I checked, people don't want to go see charred forests, which has a huge impact. And then not only that, when you think about when the wood burns, the value of the wood is less. So those are just a couple of the challenges. Another one is the national forests. I think many people see them as national forests. That's the federal government. The federal government will take care of it. But they're Californians' forests. They're all of our forests. But for some reason, we're unwilling to invest in them. But here's what I tell many groups. If you're expecting the Forest Service to have enough money to do what we need to do, you're sadly mistaken. Now, we've worked really closely, and there's a couple tools that you mentioned about stewardship contracting and good neighbor authority. We've been working with collaboratives as an agency since 2009. And what we realize is that we as an agency will need help from a lot of different people if we're going to get our forest back in a resilient state. Stewardship contracting is a part of that, and that was in 2014. What stewardship contract allows us to be able to do is we trade the value of the wood for doing restoration work on the national forest, which leads me back to my first issue with the biomass. So we know we need to get rid of the small material. That small material doesn't have a lot of value. And so in a lot of cases, we end up with projects that we don't move the material. So we've invested in doing the analysis, but you don't move the material. So now I've got a double whammy, as I call it. I've got an investment that really doesn't make a big difference on the landscape. Another one is good neighbor authority. Good neighbor authority, as of the 2014 Farm Bill, allows states to spend money on national forests, which is the first time that's ever happened. There was a Wyden authority before. Wyden allowed the Forest Service to spend money on private land, but now the Farm Bill allows states to spend money on national forests. And so we are working with a lot of different groups. Dave may talk a little bit about the Tahoe Central Sierra Initiative, where we're taking advantage of greenhouse gas funds to use on the national forests. And then we have an agreement where the regional foresters signed with Secretary Laird a Good Neighbor Authority MOU that allows us to, over the overall umbrella with the resource agencies in the state, to be able to use those funds on national forests. And so you think about, okay, so what? Well, guess what that means? That means access to cap and trade. It also means access to the water bond that exists. So for us, you think about, I don't disagree what's identified as a challenges for us. Something else I think is that for us as an agency, we're going to have to ask on a lot of people with a lot of expertise to help us get our work done. For us, typically as an agency, we're kind of seen, the Forest Service is seen as the experts across the world in forestry. And so sometimes that can be a hamper because we feel like, we've got to do it because we're the experts. I think there's an opportunity for us to take advantages of other people's skills to help us get analysis done and help us get projects done. So there are some challenges, but I think there are some opportunities, and I think that we're moving in a way to help us manage in our national forests. But we still have some things that we're going to have to work on. And it's not going to be short term. It's not going to happen next week or next year. It's going to be an investment that we have to make. Or we just continue to sit back, as I call it, and watch our national forests go up in smoke. So thus far this year on national forests, we burnt a little over 410,000 acres of fire just on national forests.
On that happy note, so Barney, I'm going to come back to you with a couple questions in a bit here, but I want to move on to Susie here real quickly. So Susie, your expertise is what I would call the family forest, the smaller forests, less than 5,000 acres, not typical production timber. When we started this project, frankly, that was almost invisible to us, what was going on. We knew that the timber harvest plans had to be developed, and it was managed principally through the state. But what we didn't hear enough of until we actually started on this project is where the real tough things are for people to actually do good work in the forest. Now, you remember we've set a clear objective in what we think has to happen, and that is we have to take these dense, dry, dying forests and actually restore resiliency through reduction in fuels. So I want to hear from you where you think the major stumbling blocks are for the family forest. Again, less than 5,000 acres, but it turns out there's a lot of them in aggregate, which means a whole lot of different people with different ideas about how to manage their land. And
Like you.
Like me, yeah. I'm part of the problem.
I'm his extension agent.
We have a little cabin in the mountains in a high fire district and all that other stuff. So, but it's not about me, it's about you. So Susie, give us your sort of take of the big challenges for the family forests and the family forest management.
Sure. So just a little bit about what I do. I'm an extension forester for the University of California Cooperative Extension, and I cover 4 counties in the Central Sierra: El Dorado, Amador, Calaveras, and Tuolumne counties. And my role is to help landowners kind of know which way to go. We have a profession in California, a licensing program called Registered Professional Foresters. And so if you're a private landowner, you need to have a RPF help you design and carry out any kind of management action. And so we have a very active community. And my role is kind of education and outreach, I feel, to help people know where they need to go with their forests, get them involved in more active management. Yes, there are a lot of barriers to that for private landowners. Basically, we have a regulatory system in California, which you may be surprised to know is fairly strict. And probably pretty much more strict than any other state in the country. And so there's a fairly tall order for a landowner to do any kind of thinning or timber harvest to fall within the regulations. There's a need for funding to do that. A lot of our activities, if you're doing a fuels reduction project and you have small trees, are not actually going to pay for themselves. Most of our landowners at the smaller scales really are not making a lot of money. There is a gradient throughout your area of land ownership sizes and opportunities to actually make income off your forest properties. And in my area, it's fairly rare. So people are 50 acres, 10 acres, 100 acres. You're not going to be farming your forest and that acreage size. And so it's not, the primary goal of most of these landowners is not as an income property. Most folks are loving the landscape. They want to have their cabin in the woods like you, or they want to have their rural lifestyle. There are some larger ownerships where, actually making money is possible, but I think it's pretty rare in the whole scheme of things. And so our regulatory system is set up in order to make the forests meet a certain standard of density and stocking. And it's just really unpractical for a lot of people to do a lot of that work when they're not getting any income from their property. So we do have a series of incentive programs that do help people that are administered through some of our state and federal agencies. What I'm personally finding in my area is just we have so much disturbance going on right now. So in my 4 counties, we had the King Fire, the Rim Fire, the Butte Fire, the Sand Fire, the Angora Fire, and large disturbances. And then the whole southern part of my area now is beetle mortality. So people are losing 90% of their overstory. Or if they're really small landowners, they're having to spend tens of thousands of dollars to have trees cut out around their homes. So it's a lot of disturbance going on, and I don't think that we're necessarily thinking about the future and how to help people move forward. So forest resilience is something that can be done before your disturbance. Hopefully you would do that. You would thin it, you would burn it, you would do whatever you need to make your forest healthy so it's not as vulnerable to dying in wildfires or bark beetle outbreaks. But we have substantial areas where all of that has already happened. And how are we thinking about the future in those areas? And one of your questions is what keeps me up at night. I feel that we have not necessarily organized our agencies to be nimble enough to be responding to these things. So at the federal level, they do have a post-fire process where they go in and they can figure out where to replant when needed, but they don't have a lot of funding. They don't have the capacity to do it all the places that they need. With private landowners, we have a kind of a, here is our general format. We plan for years and years to do an activity in a forest, but after a wildfire, we have huge areas of private landowners who need help figuring out how to plant, what to do, funding to do it. And we are not set up in a nimble way to be responding to these things. We are thinking of business as usual, like 5 years out, we'll do a thinning, we'll do this. But in my area, if you're not in there replanting right away, you are encouraging shrubs to grow up, and then it's going to be really hard to reforest. So I see areas that are slipping, and we're losing that potential for reforesting, adding carbon, adding trees to that area.
Again, this is the continuing and on that happy note. I want
you didn't ask me for the happy note.
I want you to react real quickly to this concept of trying to unify multiple disparate landowners
Sure.
into special districts, as whether this is something that might actually work.
Well, let me say that different levels of ownership are all interdependent. So we're here representing different landowners, but all of our landowners are interdependent. Private landowners are very dependent on the Forest Service and how they do their management actions and reduce their fire risks. They're very dependent on mill capacity from industrial land ownerships. It's really important. So if there's no mill to take your wood to, you can't pay for your thinning treatment. And the federal government is very dependent on industrial land ownerships as well. So we all need to work together. Some solutions for one will help all of us. But we all need our own little help. So your question was about forest health districts. Mm-hmm. I saw that in the report. I have not heard that idea before, but I liked it. Definitely in the post-fire environment, I'm in an interview project right now where I'm interviewing landowners who were all burned out by a fire and asking them how do they decide about reforestation. And a lot of them, without some central organizing entity, really are not able to. In my area, your house burned, everything burned. You're kind of busy thinking about rebuilding your house. And so if you had an overall organizing entity to help you reforest or help you do your thinning before your disturbance, I think that would be very helpful. I know it's possible in other countries. I was in France last year. They have a system of landowners unions with those folks represented at the table in any actions in their area, and they have the ability to gather money and market together. So I think that'd be fabulous.
Some of the collaboratives that the Forest Service runs. So I want to move on to David real quickly. So we've been mostly talking about trees and the harvesting of trees. And of course, there's multiple benefits that are associated with these forests, and it's a particular challenge. One of the things we have said, and I want you to react to it, in this is that if we're going to shift to long-term management, we have to live with short-term pain and inconvenience. And these are things like loss of habitat in some areas, with the idea that you're planning for habitat over a larger area, air quality impacts, short-term water quality impacts. When you sort of scope that and the work that you guys are doing in particular, how do you handle that fact that, most of you, I know all your scientific colleagues are going to tell you the same thing. You can't just have short-term reaction. You got to have a long-term plan, and there's going to be some pain involved in the game. How do you guys deal with that?
Yeah, I'll address that, but I first want to introduce maybe a note of optimism or hope into
well, I was going to get to that.
So I think a lot of factors are coming together to help us address what is a thorny problem, and I just mentioned a couple of them. One, there really is increasing social acceptance and agreement among a core group about the kind of steps that need to be taken. And one example of that is the California Forest Watershed Alliance that TNC is part of, with water utilities, the timber industry, and rural counties. And we don't agree on everything, but we have a common core of agreements around the need for more active forest management, and we're starting to bring that messaging forward and use that politically. So I think groups coming together is a part of it. There's some really encouraging actions on the funding side that's been mentioned. Through Proposition 1, the state has been contributing significantly to some of the work that needs to be done. Through the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, the state is also stepping up. The park bond that the legislature just passed has significant funding for forest issues. And then on the federal side, the issue of the fire borrowing, or the more and more of the agency's budget going to fire suppression. A bill was just introduced today or yesterday, a bipartisan bill in Congress that would end that practice of fire borrowing and cap the percent of the agency's budget that would go to fire funding. So, and then you add to that, there's some innovative approaches working with water utilities, working with the private sector, and I think we're making headway on the private side, on the funding side. And then finally, I would mention there's some really exciting pilot projects that are going forward, demonstration projects where we're trying innovative approaches. One is the French Meadows project that we're working with Placer County Water Agency, Placer County, Sierra Nevada Conservancy, and others on. We're testing new approaches to getting work done at scale. And then really most exciting, just announced a couple weeks ago, is this Tahoe Central Sierra Initiative. This is a 2.4 million acre area where the Forest Service, the Sierra Nevada Conservancy, the Tahoe Conservancy, Cal Forest, TNC, and others are going to really work to try to put together a plan, identify what will it take to get a large landscape in a more resilient condition, and then identify what will it cost, what will the benefits be, and let's put a program together to make it happen. So with that, I think there's really a lot of positive happening. I know this is a difficult issue, but I don't want folks leaving feeling like it's hopeless and there aren't opportunities. Now to your specific question, Jeff, I'll come to that. Is there a trade-off between short-term impacts and long-term benefits? We think that overall ecologically based forest management, if you look at ecologically based thinning, use of prescribed fire, managed wildfire, it's going to have short and long-term benefits in terms of forest resilience and forest health. And we don't think it's likely to have significant short-term adverse impacts. That said, if we go in and we log too heavily, near a nesting site for a California spotted owl, yes, there is the potential for some short-term impacts. And we've got to be careful about how we manage. We need to balance all of the impacts and benefits of activities. But if you also look at the kind of impacts to the spotted owl from the King Fire and the Rim Fire, what we've learned is that those mega fires, those high severity fires that are burning large expanses at high severity, those are having pretty negative impacts on spotted owls and other habitat features as well. So what I'd say is there really is, there's hope, there's opportunities, there's a lot of neat things happening, and I think we should avoid getting mired in the specific details and really focus on the broader agreement that is being forged to move forward proactively with the kind of management that's needed to get our forests in a healthier condition.
So, Barney, I know I keep harping on this because this is one of the things as we did our interviews and we just kept discovering was that there was this concept of the very complex and burdensome permitting that is associated with trying to get this stuff done. Is that your number one hurdle that you guys have to, is it permitting or is it money? Is it social? Pick one. I'm making you pick one. I'm being evil. That you could wave the Barnie Gyant magic wand over and really change what would have a substantial impact on the pace and scale.
You didn't hear me say a system, did you?
What's that?
It's not as simple as that from not my vantage point. So we have to do analysis. So in order for us to do analysis, so ARC, we got to go through the State Historic Preservation Office. If I got T&E species, I got to go through consultation with the Fish and Wildlife Service. If I've got fish, I got to go through the National Marine Fishery Service to get consultation done. If I'm burning, I got to go work through the air boards. If I'm doing any other thing, I've got to work through the water boards. So for me, you got to remember, so people think, oh, that's the federal government, you can go do what you want, but you got to remember that the states existed before federal government, so we're like an overlay. So those are things that we have to be able to go through. A part of it, so I started my career as a biologist, so my perspective was this. is because we didn't have trust and social license, we did a lot of analysis to try to make our documents bulletproof. And we still have lengthy documents, and we're looking at, okay, how can we really streamline that? And then at the same time, really look at short-term effects for long-term gain. But that's still something that we have to work on. Now, in 2011, the agency, the region, said we needed to treat anywhere between 6 to 9 million acres, about 500 a year, 500,000 a year. Here's a part of that system that I want to talk about. Even if I treated 500,000 acres and say a big part of that was mechanical, there's limitations on where to take a lot of my smaller, no value material. So even though you might have the analysis done, you still have to do something with the material, because now, just bear along with me on this, but when a tree is a tree and not a stump, I'm not meeting the objectives on the land. So as long as that tree or that fuel still is on the landscape in a lot of cases, now what I've got is I've got a fuel problem. So for us, we've kind of said, like, moving the small trees is mandatory in our contracts. You need to do that smartly, but there still has to be a place to take the material.
Yeah. So what you're telling me is this is something we ran into in our interviews, is the infrastructure problem with the steady decline in the number of sawmills, places to do the biomass. This is a big issue, and whether that's a federal responsibility, a state responsibility, or local landowners, I think what we kept running into is assurances that there would be a ready market and the marketability of that material. So Susie, when you are looking at the smaller landowners, this is a big issue for them. If they haven't got a place to take their material and a ready market for it, there's zero incentive for them to do, certainly zero financial incentive. But let me go to the other thing that, I have a place in the foothills, and I've gotten to know a lot of people up there. Mm-hmm. And they're a very independent, and I'm doing it in the politest way I can say it, very independent, self-reliant people who really are not interested in anybody telling them what to do. Is there the capacity in those groups, in those small groups, to actually work collaboratively over these large landscapes, which is what we're promoting? You've got to get at that landscape scale. If it's a 50 or 100 acre site, here and there as a patchwork, it's not going to have a major effect. We've got to get it at a big scale. Is there the capacity, you think, for that in those communities? You know them, you work with them.
With incentives, of course.
Yes, that's right. The Water Policy Center, we quote Mark Reisner all the time. Water flows uphill to money. So you're saying money would help here?
Money helps,
yeah.
Absolutely. Think about your property, right? If things are going to cost you a lot of money, what are your incentives? You can work together for that. That helps a lot. I'm sorry, I'm stuck on this idea of social license being the problem, because I've heard that from my last two speakers, and also it's in the report. And when I read that, I thought, really? I think we're really past that in a lot of areas. And I just wanted to refer to a project I was on with both David and Barney for 7 or 8 years, the Sierra Nevada Adaptive Management Project, where we worked with stakeholders very intensively. We took them out in the woods. We asked them what they thought about short-term impacts of treatments and long-term impacts. We did social surveys. We did email surveys. We did interviews and talked to them. And the informed folks all felt that, there might be some small-term impact, but it was nothing compared to the long-term impacts of severe fire. They, in fact, thought most of the treatments were too light to lead to forest health, and that the Forest Service in the area that we were at was not treating enough to reduce the fire threat. So I would say amongst the informed public, I don't think social license is one of the barriers. Maybe at the state level, maybe at the policy level, national players, I don't know. But in communities where we all are, I don't think social license is a barrier. I think we're all saying, get it done. Could you please get it done? Could you get it done?
Or can you help us get it done?
Okay, so can you help us get it done?
Right, somebody get it done. So David, we're going to go to Q&A here in a second. But my sister, who lives in Pacific Palisades, in Southern California, when I was telling her what we were doing, she said, can somebody explain to me, beyond the fact that as a kid, I wandered around in the Sierras, and it's a really beautiful place, why I should care, and the context of our conversation was more than why I should care, why I should help pay for it. Remember, so she's in Pacific Palisades, she gets water from the Colorado River, she gets it from the Delta, she gets it from groundwater, Owens Valley, a big mix of water in the LA. Okay, convince my sister for me. And you've got 3 minutes to do this because you're riding in an elevator with her. So convince my sister that she should care and be willing to help pay for it.
Yeah, thanks. I think
Yeah,
I think there are two reasons why people should care and should invest. The first is if you're a nature lover like me, you're a tree hugger, then what we're seeing in the forest is not good for nature. We're losing biodiversity, we're losing habitat, we're losing old growth forests that many of us fought for many years to protect. So if you love nature and you love wildlife, then you should be significantly concerned about what's happening in the forest. Now, if you don't love nature, then the case has to be made for why these forests are important for people, and we think they are. You begin with the fact that these headwater forests provide roughly 2/3 of California's developed water. You go to the fact that they sequester enormous amounts of carbon and release tremendous amounts of carbon when they burn at high severity. You include the fact that these are recreationally very important sites that people love. And then on top of that, the reality is we are losing some of those values to people by virtue of high severity wildfire, insect and disease, attacks, et cetera. And there's many examples. I mean, the King Fire is a great one, burned 100,000 acres, much of that at high severity, literally tens of thousands of acres burned where almost no vegetation survives. The post-fire erosion to the American River was substantial, resulting in major costs to Placer County Water Agency, but also major negative impacts to nature and to water quality. So we've got examples like that, and the basic bottom line is we have been taking for granted the values that our headwater forests provide. We've just been assuming that they're up there and everything is fine. Everything is not fine, and if we don't take action, things are going to continue to get worse. We're going to continue to see fires getting larger, hotter, and more destructive. We're going to have more insect and disease problems, and that's going to have a lot of negative effects, not only for nature, but also for people, whether you live in the Sierra or whether you live in Pacific Palisades or elsewhere in California.
So I'm going to finish with one last thing. There was a couple of recent articles that came out, and it got a little bit of newspaper play, which said there's nothing we can do about this. It's all going to transition anyways because of climate change. And I'm going to leave this open to all three of you to respond to this last statement, that why don't we just let it burn and let it go and adapt? Why should we intervene? Why should we spend the money and time and energy and intervene? By the way, we had this conversation with lots of people, so it's not completely out of the blue. I'm going to let you start, David, and finish up.
I guess I'd reiterate, all the values that are at stake. I don't think, climate change certainly makes the problem more challenging, but it doesn't make it an impossible problem. What it means is the forests are likely to be hotter and drier. It makes it even more important that the condition of the forests are relatively resilient so that when drought occurs, when fire occurs, and when climate change occurs, that the forests are in a state where they can better adapt. And so those kind of drivers like fire and insects aren't going to permanently or for centuries, eliminate forests, but that the forest will be able to survive.
Sorry, go ahead.
By all means, let's do more to try to address climate change. Let's not take that as an inevitability yet.
Susie.
No, that's the other thing that keeps me up at night. Climate is really an important part of what's going on, but it's not the only thing going on. And so in areas where I worry about forest transition to shrublands, that could be happening without any climate input. As long as you have big fires that burn 10,000 acres, there's no seed trees left to seed the next generation. So the seeds from trees don't hang out in the seed bank or sprout back up spontaneously. If there's no tree left, then there's no seedlings left. And so in these areas where we have big fires, you have a transition to a shrubland system for 40, 50, some years. Eventually they would come in without climate change, but we're missing opportunities for restoring our forests if we think climate means that it'll never grow back there.
Right. Barney, you get the last word, and it's a short one.
As long as man is a part of the environment, it makes a big deal. You think about the wood products that we use, the air we breathe, how much of your body is made of water and all other living things, is pretty basic. So if we don't help protect our forest and our environment, we may no longer be here.
Oh, on that happy note, some of you know my nickname is Dr. Doom, and I'm living up to it today. So here's what we're going to do now. We're going to do a Q&A, and we will until half past. And then I do want to remind you, when we're done, our panelists will be happy to stick around, and of course, Van, if you want to grab a chair and come up, because what we're going to do for the Q&A is allow you to ask Van a question, since he's the lead author on the report as well. Here's what I want you to do on the Q&A. Wave your hand, and we will bring you a microphone. And the reason it's microphone is you're on television. So you're being streamed on the web, so that's why we want you to use the microphone.
All right, thank you. I've heard several times in the last week and today that the lack of mill capacity to handle logging due to thinning or removal of dead yet standing trees. What are the obstacles to regaining that capacity in the Central Valley from Kern County all the way to Shasta? And what can federal agencies, or what are federal agencies, and what is California's government doing to ameliorate those obstacles?
This is a really good question, and we ran into this many times. Barney, do you want to field that first and let others respond to it?
So for us in the federal government, we rely on our partners like the California Forestry Association. Steve Brink's in the audience today. I tell you a big thing on the capacity is a lot of the low value material no one wants. And that's a big part of it. So now if you were to think about, okay, so what about mill capacity for saw logs? Probably that industry would grow along with saw logs. But when you think about low value materials such as biomass, nobody wants it. After a while, after diseased trees, you get blue stain. It's not marketable. And so those are a couple big things. And so that's why I talk about we have to incentivize the use of our own wood, if that makes sense.
Yeah. David, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things that we can do. One is the industry needs greater assurance of supply over a longer period of time in order to make investments in additional capacity. So on the federal side, the use of these stewardship contracts, which provide an assurance of supply over a period of up to 10 years and potentially longer, and also planning projects at a larger scale like this Tahoe Central Sierra Initiative, so that we have got NEPA cleared on a much larger area, and that will allow investments to be made where a profit is to be had. As far as the lower value material, I do think that it's incumbent upon us as a society to provide some kind of incentive or some kind of subsidies in order to make use of that low value material because of the other benefits that they're providing in terms of fuels reduction, in terms of wildlife habitat, carbon sequestration, water, et cetera. So I think the state, the federal government, some of this is already being done, needs to help the biomass energy industry to get on its feet and to make use of some of the lower value material.
Susie, you want to?
It's a huge issue for family forest owners to not have the mill capacity. However, one bright spot has been their ability to export, and there has been some limited export going on during this forest health crisis of logs going to China out of the Port of Stockton. And so that's one option that the Forest Service cannot do. But boy, if they could, that might be helpful. I'm sure that's a national law. But
So let me give you an example. So in Southern Sierras, you have one facility for saw logs, and it has a capacity of maybe about 30 million at best, federal land and private land. And so that's the only one in the Southern Sierras. Okay, and so now guess where tree mortality is at? Tree mortality is in Grand Central, where that is. And so now you're like, okay, so what do we do with all this material that's on federal land and private land, and it doesn't pencil out to move it because it's low value material? And so that's why you say, okay, so now you have to incentivize it some way, because if we don't move it, the problem still exists of that system that's gone bad. And then in Southern Cal too, you got to remember, it's not just that, but outside of the biomass facilities here, dealing with the tree mortality, we normally compete with fruit growers. So if you think about driving down I-5 or 99 and you look at all those orchards that are there, so when they pull those trees up, they usually also use that material for biomass. So you say, wow, if you really look how big they are, Houston, we really do have a problem. What do we do with the material?
So actually, I want to follow up real quickly on this, because one of the common misconceptions for those of you who are also watching on the web is that all dead trees are equal, and that is trees killed by fire and trees killed by beetle. Are they of the same value, meaning as potential standing timber, or are there significant differences? Which one of you wants to answer that? Because it is a big difference between the two.
Oh, go ahead, Susan.
I would just say the biggest difference is the amount of time it could stand on the stump before it needs to be moved to a processing facility. We know from experience that fires could be having sound logs afterwards from anything between a year to 2 or 3 years, depending on the species, whereas trees killed by beetle mortality are really, really dry. 3 months at the most. They're stained with blue stain, which is not a quality that affects the integrity of the wood, but it affects its marketability. And so the Forest Service cannot move in 3 months to get anything out of the woods. Maybe they can do some fire salvage. Private landowners could potentially get it out in that amount of time, but it's a race against time.
Okay. Question there we are. In the back.
Yeah, this is first directed to Barney. You said a big chunk of your pie goes to fighting wildfires that you didn't have before. So we're familiar with FEMA as a response agency to disasters, but one of their other missions when they're not fighting disasters is hazard mitigation, both at the local level and at the state level. At the state level, there's a lot of different agencies there covering a lot of different infrastructure there and a lot of different concerns. And fires for California is one of the biggest concerns. So a lot of these planning efforts look at interdependencies between different systems like water and the forest, energy, what have you. So what's your relationship in that cycle, both the state, local, and federal level?
So like for example, in February 2016, I think we started in 2016. So we've got a prescribed fire MOU that's got like 18 signatories on it, where we look at how do we look at putting fire back on the landscape. I think that's another good reason why, like, the Good Neighbor Authority also helps us. So now we can take advantage of state agencies being able to use resources to help us with prescribed burning is just an example.
I want to follow up on that, because this is now that we've had Hurricane Irma, Harvey, and soon to be Maria, the Federal Emergency Management Agency is very heavily invested in trying to, or at least makes an attempt to be invested in hazard mitigation. And wildfire is a hazard, and mitigation for that hazard, has the federal government stepped in? I mean, when you think about it, we have 100-year floodplains that FEMA has invested through the National Flood Insurance Program very heavily in. Do we have such a thing on the federal side on fire, hazard mitigation for fire?
No.
Short answer. Okay.
Private side, we do. In my area, we've had FEMA grants for wood roof replacements to help reduce the risk of private landowners.
But is there a stick that's associated with that carrot, which is what the National Flood Insurance Program is?
In a zoning sort of way, no.
Okay.
And just thinking of it, when you look at the national budget, so if there was to be a program established in the Forest Service that dealt like with FEMA, who do you take the money from?
Yeah, no.
And so that's what makes that difficult for that to have movement, is that when everyone is trying to protect their own, like in the case of trying to be responsible to the Forest Service, makes that difficult.
Okay.
Could I say we have a stick at the state level? We have a fire hazard zoning.
Right.
That is an effective way to help guide people how to build their homes. So we do have
really
it.
increases the price of your insurance, by the way. Yeah.
And this is actually the point I was going to make, is that in California, insurers oftentimes actually don't want to insure some of these properties, and the state requires it. So we actually have a statewide system where insurance agencies are having to insure homes and write policies they don't want to actually do.
Yeah.
And yet they have to do it. And so we have a system that is encouraging bad development, basically.
one wonders whether there wouldn't be an opportunity there, much as the National Flood Insurance Program is almost 50 years old. It's had some impacts. In the back.
We have a question from the Twitter feed of Tulare Basin Wildlife for you guys. What roles do you see lower watershed managers playing in upper watershed management moving forward?
Well, David, I know you think about this a lot.
Yeah, I think that the downstream beneficiaries of the upper watershed management are kind of increasingly realizing that they are indeed benefiting from good forest management, and on the flip side of the coin, that they are being adversely affected from these high severity fire kind of events. So I think the science and the research to quantify the benefits, whether it be water or carbon or otherwise, is still ongoing, but as a general matter, we know that healthy forests, and healthy meadows, healthy watersheds not only are important for biodiversity, but are also provide benefits downstream. So as we continue to make that connection, the hope is that those who see and understand the benefit will increasingly support and contribute to upper watershed management.
David, is the stumbling block monetizing this? Putting an actual price value on it? I mean, this is one of the things when we were doing this, we really struggled with this, and that's why you notice us not spending a lot of time on that in the report, is that the science wasn't really supporting it well. In a way, we could definitively say, this is the value for you downstream folks of doing this kind of work.
I think in some areas that's true. If we want to quantify water supply benefits from thinning,
Yeah.
there is a need for more research to really nail that down, and that research is ongoing. So, but that's going to take time. I think in the meantime, the general narrative that healthy headwaters and healthy watersheds are important downstream is something we need to continue to promote as we further quantify and hopefully monetize those benefits.
And I'm sorry, I don't want to let you go on this, because what will it take to convince people? I mean, seriously, what does it take to convince Sacramento that it is in their interest to make major investments in their watershed?
As we look around the West, a lot of it is actually having the adverse impact from a wildfire. So, for example, in the French Meadows project in the American River Headwaters, Placer County Water Agency and Placer County are at the table, and they're contributing significantly in kind as well as financially to try to better manage the land around its reservoirs. And that's partly because they've had the experience from the King Fire that it's cost them millions of dollars to try to clean up their watershed. So I think having that experience, hopefully we all won't have to have that experience, because by then it might be too late, but as these kind of examples add up, the hope is we'll cross a tipping point where people will really have an aha moment and get, wow, this really does matter, we need to do more.
Okay, we had another question. Here's our...
Thanks for this informative, if somewhat depressing, lunch
We're
hour.
going to end on a happy note, I promise.
And I guess I wanted to make sort of an observation that a lot of this conversation has been focused on thinning and prescribed fires and these different activities that we can take in the short term to change the stand structure to try and help account for the fact that in the past we've logged out all the large trees, we've suppressed fire, and we've created this stand structure that has no historical analog, really, in history probably. But dealing with that is only part of the challenge, because we've removed all these large trees from the landscape, and we're missing a lot of those elements that are going to take another century or however long to develop and to really get back to that more robust definition in my mind of forest health and resilience, those bigger, more fire-resistant trees, open areas, wet meadows. And so I just want to make sure that as part of the conversation, we're recognizing that broader context for getting back to a really fully functioning, healthy watershed condition, and that's going to take the general public getting involved as well, because just looking to landowners to make these changes and all of a sudden start growing big old trees on the landscape, there's a reason why that's not happening right now. The economics drive harvest at a certain point when, from a public benefit standpoint, we'd actually like to see trees, at least some of them on the landscape, be there and be much older. So I don't know if the panel has some observations along those lines, but just that broader look at what is sort of the forest health and condition that we're trying to get to.
I have one comment, and that's just to try and understand what you're saying better, that harvesting is part of making a bigger tree. I don't necessarily see those as opposite. Thinning, pre-commercial thinning, the small material, that's what we're talking about having the issue with. biomass continues to increase, if you look in the report, especially on family forest lands, and a lot of the family forest owners especially are looking to get larger, bigger trees, as is the Forest Service. So I think that's the goal. I don't think necessarily harvesting is opposed to any of that necessarily. So I wasn't exactly sure what your question was. Sorry.
Well, I think you make a good point that it's not just thinning and fuels reduction, but we really need to rebuild, especially the huge old trees that used to dominate the landscape, and it's going to take time to do that. So that needs to be part of the policy, and at least in a couple ways. One is that I think the thinning and the fuels reduction can be done in a way that, to an extent, you can accelerate the growth of those big trees. You can create small clearings around the big trees, provide them more resources to grow and that kind of thing. But the other thing, and the flip side of it, I think the risk is that if we start cutting down some of the remaining big trees in order to fund the fuels reduction, then we're really robbing Peter to pay Paul. So that really, then we're causing some ecological damage in the interest of addressing another issue, and we do need to be careful about that. And I think that's part of what makes the funding issue challenging here. A lot of the big trees have been logged out, and we want to protect and in fact nurture the remaining big trees in order to restore the full splendor of the forest ecosystem that the Europeans found when they got here.
So, I'm sorry. So for me, I'll just tell you, I think we're watching the wrong ball. For me, I'm sitting in a lot of litigation and debate about trees over 30 inches in diameter. And, I know that we're managing for species for old growth. But if I think about, one, there's not a lot of facilities that can handle trees much bigger than 30 inches. And then I often think about the millions and millions of trees that we have that are way under that size. And so for me, I think about, well, we can continue to argue about those 10 and go to litigation. And while we're going through litigation, they burn. For instance, on the Klamath on West Side, as we're debating back and forth with the Fish and Wildlife Service, short-term gain for long-term benefits, we burnt up 94 alpacs. And when I mean burn them up, I mean the trees are gone. So the next time that's going to be forest again is going to be 100 years from now. So for me, I think about when you look at, we manage 20% of the state, 20 million acres. We're watching the wrong ball because we're doing a lot of things are in place to make sure that we have the big old trees. But right now I'm thinking about, wow, we're burning up communities, we're burning up homes, we're filling up reservoirs when people want water. We are destroying habitat for a lot of other species. And so I personally think about, wow, we've got to behave differently because this negative piece is really affecting us all in a lot of negative ways.
Yeah, I just wanted to say in the report, we addressed this a little bit when we show the different cost and harvest levels of mechanical thinning. And we never look at any thinning options that are bigger than 16 inches. So, I mean, we never look at cutting big trees as an option. I think that in California is typically not an option, actually. I'm not sure that's a common discussion. I guess you two would know more, but in the options we show where there's opportunities to still make money on some of these mechanical thinnings, we're talking about 16-inch trees.
And I should clarify, I'm sorry, I was really speaking to the private land side of things because the economic considerations on public lands are entirely different. But if you're a private landowner and looking at getting value out of your property, once your trees get to 25, 30 inches, you're looking at, hey, that's a good commercially viable log that I can get down to the mill. And that's the destiny for a lot of those trees, and we need to be making sure that on the private land portions of the state as well as the public land, that we're recruiting some of those older forest characteristics. That's my point.
Yeah, I'm curious about your thoughts on how the insurance industry might be interested in helping with some of this, especially obviously in areas where they have a lot of properties that they insure, both on the macro level in terms of funding directly some of the activities that need to be done, but also on the micro level for individual landowners. I have a half acre up in El Dorado County, and we got rid of a few dead trees this year, and I could imagine how that would be a risk reduction to the insurance industry to have a safer property there. So is there a way that insurance companies could get involved in, lowering premiums for landowners that choose to help with these forest restoration efforts, or just on the larger scale in terms of, voluntarily helping to fund some of these necessary programs that need to be done.
Good question, good question.
Yeah, it's a good idea. At least the Nature Conservancy hasn't made much headway. We have had conversations with the insurance industry, and the reason is that although the damage seems large to us, it pales in comparison to the kinds of things they typically insure, like, fires in Los Angeles, hurricane damage, that kind of thing. So, I think we need to the costs need to be significant enough to get even on their radar screen. Now, it could be there's some places like around Lake Tahoe where you've got property values that are high, or other places, near homes and communities. But in general, I think in the rural Sierra, the values, although significant to us, aren't making enough of a dent to the insurance industry to say we're going to try to invest to reduce the risk.
Yeah, I've talked to the insurance industry a little bit about this, because I do think it's an interesting lever to think about, and an area where there could be a lot of collaboration, because nobody wants a house where it's going to burn, and nobody wants to have to insure that house. So it seems like there should be an area where people could work together. Part of the problem is actually technical. Models that show fire risk at the parcel scale, the big two companies that build these models that insurance agencies use don't show it at that scale. They're not that fine-grained. There's models that are out there that people have made for academic reasons that might be useful for that, but in general, just the models that are used by insurance industry don't look at the scales that you're talking about.
And they're a little bit of a black box as well.
Yeah.
And individual companies have their own models, and it's hard to know exactly how they're making their decisions. My understanding is there is a CAL FIRE pilot project going on right now, trying to work with the insurance industry to identify reduction of hazard activities on specific properties that then CAL FIRE could say, yes, they meet these standards, and be part of the interaction between the homeowner and the insurance company. And I believe the pilot's in El Dorado County, so.
It's on your half acre.
me.
And I remind you, again, back to the National Flood Insurance Program, that is a system where the leverage comes through insurance, but principally through that you require, that you have to adhere to the National Flood Insurance Program for federally backed mortgages. And so it's actually a potentially very powerful lever, which would make many people in the foothills, I can tell you, quite upset if you actually tried to use that lever. We have time for one more question, and then I have to wrap up.
We've talked about biofuel a lot, and that it's basically not economically feasible in most areas now. Is there some way the market can change that's going to make it so, or is there a benefit to public subsidizing digesters in Miwok Village and all the little towns or whatever, in order to make it so that it's actually beneficial towards forest health?
Good question. How do we do this? Barney, I know you think about this all the time, and I know David has some opinions on it, but the question that we would ask is, do you have to just simply state the obvious? It needs a subsidy. It needs a substantial subsidy. Does it?
It had a subsidy.
It did for a
during
while.
the first set of Brown administrations, and it was a pretty healthy industry.
Yeah. So can it only be sustained by a subsidy at this point, or is this an industry that can get strong enough? Does the price of energy have to go up a lot to make this work?
Yeah,
Brian,
I
I know
think
you
that,
think about this.
yeah, I think the price of energy would have to go up quite a bit in order to make that happen. That's why I had mentioned a little earlier that we have to diversify and create some other markets for smaller material. And, for me, so, tree mortality, it exists in the state, but we still have a huge need for using and reducing small material across all the national forests. So even when we get done with the different tiers and the tree mortality, we still have millions of acres that need to be treated, and a lot of that is the smaller, low-value material. And so for instance, I did mention, many of us in this room spend a lot of time trying to help increase the amount for biomass, for energy production. And it really wasn't until my perception, it really wasn't until with the tree mortality that, the contracts were extended. But it was right up until the whistle where the contracts were about ready to expire, and then 6 of them were extended. But it was at the last minute. And they're only for 5 years. But a question for me is like, what happens at the end of 5 years? So we can't just sit and wait for those 5 years to be up. We're gonna have to think about what in the world do we do with that material and develop some different alternatives, different products now, because we still have a problem even beyond tree mortality.
So I want to wrap up now, first by thanking the panelists. This was fascinating. You guys did a great job, and particularly I want to thank Van and Henry for the very heavy lift on producing what I think is an excellent paper, and I do appreciate it. And it's a paper that'll get some legs as we pass it around. But I want to end on a happy note in all of this. Let me give you an example. So I'm mostly in the water business, and in 2006 we passed a flood legislation in California, which was an extraordinary step forward in the reform. Why did we do that in 2006? Hurricane Katrina in 2005. Actually, we ignored the earlier floods. In 2014, we passed the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, probably the biggest change in water, at least in a generation, some will argue 100 years, that it's made extraordinary change. Why did we do that? Because we were in the middle of a drought. So these dead, dry, dying forests that we're seeing have actually awakened awareness at a level none of you have ever experienced in the course of your careers. And that the legislature, who principally just ignored the upper watershed, is now actually very interested beyond the people who represent locals. That we hear it from the governor's office on down, we hear it on the federal side. So what I would argue is this is an extraordinary moment. And it's an exceptional opportunity, not to be wasted. I think Susie said, maybe would you say, I'm not sure who said it, but once they're dry and fallen down, will we forget? And we will lose that opportunity. So I see this as an exceptional opportunity. And so I would say the advice that we don't have in the paper is think boldly while you can. Well, people are doing this because I see this as an exceptional opportunity. And so with all that, I'd like you to thank the panelists and thank you all for coming today. And we're willing to stick around and answer questions if anybody wants to hang out. Again, thanks for coming.